Hi, my name's Jake Vostenkemper, Director of Agronomy and Research here at Liqui-Grow.
Hi, I'm Chris Stevens, Technology Specialist here at Liqui-Grow.
Fantastic, Chris. Well, Katie says that once we're done making this video for the day, Chris, we can be let off the hook. So let's get this done.
Oh, thank God.
All right, so today we are going to talk about what's Jake going to be doing for the next 2-3 years here? What else am I looking at? What else am I investigating? We're going to talk about some preliminary data as a results to some more nutrient placement work. But before we get into all those details and menage a trois, we need to talk a little bit about where we've came from and kind of where we're headed. Okay, so on the first slide here today, you're going to see my distance study. I know I've talked about this study a lot, but the only reason I bring it up is, with this ExactStrip technology that I've been researching and talking about for several years now, this was kind of the first potential use case for using RTK guidance to precisely place nutrients. Mm-hmm. So what else could we use this RTK guidance to precisely place nutrients for? What other utility, what other potential offerings could we develop for the customer based on this conceptual technology? We've had a lot of, we've got some commercial experience. We've got on a lot of acres. This has driven some enthusiasm. But Chris, we're just getting started, right?
Oh yeah. There's so much more coming down the pipeline that you're working on.
We've also, just to review, and if you want to hear me talk in a lot more detail about both of these studies I'm going to reference here in the beginning, there's several different videos where I've talked about this in more detail. But just kind of to continue to wrap up the discussion here before we move forward, this is our nutrient placement study. We learned with the ExactStrip technology that for the highest yield increase utilizing this technology, you want to apply the P and the K fertilizer after the final tillage pass, whether that's with strip tillage, so you apply it after the strip till pass, or if you're more conventional or full width tillage, you want to apply that ExactStrip fertilizer either after the final tillage pass or make sure you're not disturbing that band greatly. Maybe you're doing a one pass tool, very minimum tillage, that's probably okay. But to run a chisel plow through or a disc ripper, you're probably not going to have that band very intact once you're done doing that.
Yeah.
So where else do you think we're going to go with this technology, Chris?
I think we could use this for nitrogen.
You think?
I think we could use this for
I think
nitrogen.
You've seen this presentation prior to me talking.
I maybe know what's coming. I don't.
Okay.
I might.
All right. But before, Chris let the cat out of the bag, but before we get there, some people have asked me about on-farm studies. Have we done any big on-farm strip trials? Because most of this work I've done has been done in small plots, mm-hmm. right? Well, we partnered with John Deere, in fact. There was a field over by Geneseo. Liqui-Grow and John Deere partnered together to do an ExactStrip trial. And, we basically stripped this entire field. We had 3 treatments. We had a check, so no fertilizer applied. We had our ExactStrip fertilizer application on 30-inch centers. And then we broadcasted the same rate of fertilizer with one of our floaters. So same fertilizer, same floater. The only difference was it ExactStripped or was it broadcasted? So in this case, the farmer followed our RTK guidance lines. And this is basically, we saw about a 9 bushel yield increase averaged across 2 different hybrids in that field.
And Jake, what was the number that we had come up with off of your data?
Yeah, basically right at about 8 bushel. If you look at that distance study, the yield increase was right at about 8 bushel, and we found 9 bushel here, so, those numbers align pretty mm-hmm. darn well.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is an on-farm study, showed exactly what I've been talking about. We partnered with John Deere to do it, so fantastic on-farm replicated trial observations.
And I just wanted to double check and make sure this is not your data. This is John Deere's data, correct?
Yeah, we applied the treatments and John Deere sent me the information.
Okay.
All right, so Chris kind of let the cat out of the bag, but what about nitrogen?
I'm tired of dragging these tanks through the field, man. I got semis coming to me all the time. It slows down my planting. Is there any way that I could just have you guys do this and then not have to worry about that?
I think it's possible. And so let's talk about some of the advantages, disadvantages, and what we know today. Okay. Off the cuff, you tend not to be quite as worried about nitrogen placement because we know nitrogen's mobile. Okay. So, of course, we didn't start here because I was more convinced that placing P and K and zinc, nutrients that are not mobile, is more important than placing nitrogen because we know nitrogen is mobile. Okay. That doesn't mean there isn't a potential use case for applying nitrogen close to the crop. I just didn't think it was the number one priority. All right. And there is some information that suggests applying banded nitrogen close to the crop can increase yields and can increase nitrogen use efficiency. And so these are going to be things I'm going to be investigating going forward. But for now, I'm going to kind of talk to you about some of the data that's out there that makes a case for applying nitrogen close to the crop in a band. Okay. So the figure you're going to see here on your screen is going to be a University of Illinois study that was funded by the Nutrient Research and Education Council in the state of Illinois. And so that all those bars and charts there, that's the accumulation, or that's the average of 7 locations, and those studies were done from 2019 through 2021 in Illinois. And so what you're actually looking at there is you're looking at 2x2 banded subsurface 2x2 banded application. So kind of that traditional, nitrogen placement on the planter. And what they found is that averaged over those different rates of broadcasted versus banded nitrogen, they found about a 5 bushel yield increase on average. Okay. So that's definitely a reasonably strong data set to suggest that nitrogen placement in a band close to the crop can increase corn yields.
Okay.
So not only did they find that yields were increased on average, but they found that with the banded applications, total N uptake was greater in every single instance. And what you're looking at there on the figure in the bottom on the x-axis, you see that 45, 135, 90, 90, 135, 45. What that represents is 45 pounds of nitrogen was applied as a band or broadcasted. The remaining 135 was applied at roughly V6. And so it's the ratio of banded at planting nitrogen, whether it was banded or broadcasted, versus how much was applied side dressed at that V6 timing. Okay, so in every single case there, whether it was 180 pounds of nitrogen applied in the spring, or whether it was 45 pounds of nitrogen applied in the spring, in every single case we saw higher in uptake with the banded in applications.
So banding increases yields generally.
I mean, that's what this information would suggest. Again, I was a little less convinced that it was important with nitrogen, and I think the jury's still out. I mean, this data obviously provides a very strong evidence that it may matter, but I'm reasonably conservative and like to ask my own questions and seed my own plots, right? But this definitely provides some evidence that it will. Okay.
Okay.
In addition to that, they also found that nitrogen use efficiency, meaning that the amount of N you applied as fertilizer, the ratio of nitrogen you applied as fertilizer was higher in the banded applications than the broadcast application, meaning that more of the nitrogen that you bought and paid for made it into the crop with the banded applications close to the crop versus the broadcast applications. And I might add that this nitrogen that was broadcasted was lightly incorporated with tillage, meaning that ammonia volatilization was a non-factor in these studies because it was all subsurface applied.
And was the nitrogen source the same between the band and the broadcast?
The nitrogen source was all urea ammonium nitrate.
Okay.
So all the same. Liquid UAN 32%, or it could be 28, but yeah, 32 or 28%.
Okay.
All right, so what are the potential concerns? So there are some concerns, and so that's why we need to take our time, let me do my investigations, and figure out what the best approach is to applying nitrogen. I mean, I'm not so worried about 30 or 60 or pounds of nitrogen applied close to the crop. But when we start getting into these 100, 140, 150, 200 pounds of nitrogen, Now we're talking about a lot of salt. And we have salt injury potential, and we have ammonia toxicity injury potential also. Okay, so to kind of show you what I'm talking about, there's a Kansas State study here on your screen. And what this data is telling you is that they used 180 pounds of urea. Okay, so you have a lot of concern with ammonium or ammonia toxicity when you use straight urea. All right, but what they're showing is that yields increased when you went from 15 inches, so basically the center of a 30-inch row, to 4 inches away from the row. The yield increased by roughly 8 bushels per acre. But when you planted the crop right on top of a urea band, now you lost 4 of that 8 bushels per acre. And that was because of
ammonia
toxicity.
Ammonia toxicity.
Salt injury, ammonia toxicity, probably a combination of the two. Okay. So we do have to be a little bit careful here. That's my warning and my watch out. And I'm doing some studies to help us understand, where is the limit and how close can you be? And we'll be really conservative when we come out with those recommendations.
Jake, all this is really great information, but is there going to be some circumstances where we're more concerned about injury or less concerned? I mean, what kind of issues or what kind of situations could we run into where that's going to be a problem?
Yes, absolutely. So where we're going to be most concerned about salt injury or ammonia toxicity is going to be in low CEC soils, so sandy soils. Low CEC soils. They just have less ability and capacity to buffer the ammonia and the salt, frankly. Also, you could run into instances even in heavier ground in a dry spring. Okay. So I'm pretty confident in some cases we will see injury, but it's going to be placement and rate dependent. And that's why it's important for us to kind of hang tight and let me to continue to understand that rate placement interaction. Okay. And we're never going to 100% solve that because you can never predict every environment that's out there. But what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a pretty conservative recommendation, like, we never saw injury below 120 pounds of nitrogen applied at planting at a given distance. Okay. So those are great questions and things to think about.
I also hear a lot of retailers in our area talk about, putting anhydrous on in the spring. You want to give it at least a week to sit in the ground before you go in and plant your corn. Is that the same kind of injury that we're looking at here?
Yes. That's the ammonia toxicity that's associated with anhydrous ammonia.
Yep.
It's just that, generally speaking, the ammonia toxicity tends to be a lot longer lived with anhydrous ammonia.
Okay.
And that band tends to be, that area of potential concern tends to be a little bit wider than it does with urea or even UAN, because UAN is only half urea. Okay. And it all has to do with pH and how high the pH is and the concentration of ammonia, and that's all the highest with anhydrous ammonia. That's why it's a bigger concern. Okay. But yes, it's the same sort of problem. Okay, so now I've already started asking these questions in 2024. We'll continue in 2025, 26, but I did want to show you a little bit of preliminary data where I'm starting to ask some of these questions. All right. So this data you're looking at on your screen here, this is the average of 3 locations in 2024. And so what I was looking at here is is there a point where we start to see yields go down when you apply nitrogen right on the row? So we used RTK guidance. We applied this nitrogen in bands right where we planted the crop. Okay. And so the treatments were a 100-pound in rate, 140-pound in rate, 180-pound in rate, and 220-pound in rate. And each one of those in rates, we either broadcasted the nitrogen or we banded the nitrogen. Okay. And so it's a little bit confusing, but in every one of these treatments, there was always 220 pounds of nitrogen applied.
Okay. And how much time was it again between placement of the fertilizer and planting?
It varied by location, Chris, but I would say a couple days to maybe as much as 4 or 5 days. So pretty soon after we applied this nitrogen, we started planting corn.
So you're telling me you'd band it at 220 pounds right on top of a planting row a couple days before planting?
Yes. Yes. And this data here clearly suggests that, there wasn't much injury, if any. We do see a slight yield reduction with the banded applications as you go from 100 up to 220, but it's very slight. We also see that on average over those different N rates, we saw about a 3.2 bushel yield increase to banding versus broadcasting. So similar to the University of Illinois work. But we also see maybe yields start to go down toward those higher N rates. And kind of just as shocked as you, I was shocked that we didn't really reduce stand with that high N rate. I was actually assuming we would. And that's part of the reason why I put that in there. I wanted to see where we broke the system, and I thought 220 pounds was enough to break it. However, when you think about this for a minute, the research looking at 2x2 place nitrogen, basically suggests you could put 180 pounds of nitrogen as long as it was placed 2x2 and have very little injury, particularly in heavy soils. But in this case, how deep are we planting, Chris?
2.5 inches.
2.5, 3 inches. That's given us a decent amount of separation between the nitrogen and the seed itself. So that might be one reason why we didn't see as much injury as I expected we might see in these studies. We are going to continue to do this work and continue to understand where we do break it. And maybe that slight yield reduction with that higher N rate is real. We're going to find out. But I think it's very positive that there was a 3.2 bushel yield increase and even larger than 3.2 at some of these lower pre-plant N rates than at that 220.
And just getting back to the soils for just a minute. I mean, it's average across 3 locations. What kind of soils are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. At all my sites, I try to look at a range in soil texture and yield and productivity. One of these sites was a lighter silt loam, definitely had some sand content in it, but it was classified as a silt loam.
Okay.
That's a location I might have expected a little more injury. Didn't see any. Any significant injury.
Yeah.
The other 2 sites were much heavier, moderate to high CEC soils where you would expect not to see a lot of injury from doing something like this. But as we continue to look at more diverse sites, I'm going to be able to go back and look, did I see injury at some of these lighter textured soils, and at what point did that injury occur? But too early to slice it up like that.
All right, Jake, so we just talked about nitrogen. We just reviewed all of the ins and outs of potentially exact stripping nitrogen. But I'm still just extremely excited. I'm shaking, really. What about in-furrow stuff?
So could we apply in-furrow products with ExactStrip?
Yeah.
With the ExactStrip idea, the placement idea.
Sure.
Yeah. I think yes, potentially. So to start that conversation, we're looking at some data from some in-furrow starter trials in 2024. Before we even get into this, we have a wholesale division, and we sell starter across the Northern Corn Belt. And so I do starter trials, in-furrow starter trials every single year for the wholesale organization. Okay. So I have a pretty good thumb on when we see yield increases from starter and when we don't. All right. And what I can tell you is exactly what we already knew, frankly. I definitely see that in some environments, we see much more consistent, much larger yield increases from starter than others. All right. And so 2024 was a fantastic year for in-furrow starter yield increases. All right. And you can see that on this data here. Just for example, at the Alito site, well, I'm just gonna generally say that at all these sites, one site was planted in the middle of April. We had very cold conditions, and we were fighting rain from time to time. The other location was planted at the end of April, early May, and we were fighting rain. We were struggling to get things done because of the rain, so it was rainy and cool. And then Hampton was planted later in May, but it was extremely wet at Hampton, right? So all these locations were associated with cold, wet, and or wet conditions. There's several things that are working against the corn crop early. In cold soils, phosphorus doesn't move very much, period, but it doesn't move hardly at all in cold, wet soils. So it doesn't migrate at all toward the roots in cold, wet soils. Roots don't grow very well in cold, wet soil, so the phosphorus and the roots are not getting together in cold and or wet conditions early. Okay, and we had hints of that at all these locations, and we saw some tremendous yield increases. For example, at Aledo, when we didn't use starter, we had 283 bushel corn. Chris, would you be excited about 283 bushel corn?
I'd be jumping for joy.
Would you be more excited with 306 bushel corn?
I wouldn't know what to do with all that corn.
And so we saw the same kind of thing at Fulton at those yield levels. At Hampton, yield levels were much lower, but we still saw some big yield increases from starter.
Yeah.
Okay. And that was only 16 pounds of starter applied in furrow. All right.
16 pounds of P205.
Correct.
Okay.
Applied in furrow. Right. So that wasn't very much phosphorus, yet we saw a nice yield increase from that. Okay. And I think it's kind of helpful to understand that, a 250 bushel corn crop would require roughly 100 pounds of phosphorus. That's what it's going to take out of the soil. Okay. And only 16 pounds, which is a fraction of the total, gave us a nice yield increase here, right? So a starter is not about supplying any large quantity the total phosphorus needs. It's about meeting that period where phosphorus availability can be limited.
Okay.
So when the soils warm up, when the soils dry out, there's lots of mineralization from phosphorus in the soil, and there's plentiful availability from fertilizer phosphorus. It's that early period where phosphorus availability is really hard to come by for the crop. Okay. So, yes, I think it's possible that we could see some yield increases by adding a little bit of phosphorus to some nitrogen, perhaps, with an ExactStrip fertilizer application.
And I think that would be really beneficial also just from a ROI perspective. I mean, when you're looking at the cost of like potassium hydroxide and the 624-6 versus like our 1034-0 product, just the cost difference is crazy. Would you be able to explain just briefly potassium hydroxide and kind of how that plays into the cost of some of the seed safe in-furrow starters?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great question, and it's a great segue into why I think starter is important. So I think starter is important because, just like I described, you definitely, I've had farmers tell me, well, I've got great soils, I've got great ground, I don't need starter. Well, I think the last slide tells us that even in really high productivity soils, you can still have a nice yield increase from starter. It's just when and where are you going to have those environments where you need that early phosphorus availability, okay? And so you really have to look at starter as an insurance policy against those conditions. And so this is getting back to your question. So if you were to apply 16 pounds of phosphorus, let's say you were going to apply 100 pounds of phosphorus as DAP. Okay. So let's say now I only applied, is it 84?
You're talking about 84 pounds of product?
Yeah, so what's 16 minus 100?
Yeah, 84.
Yeah, that's right. Okay,
Yeah.
so 84. So let's say now you're only going to apply 84 pounds of DAP, and you're going to replace that with 16 pounds of P2O5 from a starter source.
Okay, I get what you're saying now, yep.
So now that phosphorus that's in the starter is only going to cost you $2, $3, maybe $4 per acre. So the cost is pretty minimal if you just reallocate funds to placement, because you're using placement now to increase availability, and you're not just buying phosphorus that may not be efficiently used. Okay, and so to make it even more affordable, now we could use something like 1032-0 and wouldn't have to have the potassium hydroxide, because the potassium hydroxide is a safer source of potassium than KCl.
Just a low salt, basically.
It's a lower salt form of potassium. So that's why we use the potassium hydroxide in products like 624-6, because it's a seed safe potassium source. Now we don't have to worry about those seed-safe products necessarily because we're not applying it in furrow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, it could even become, instead of that maybe $4 an acre, maybe we're talking 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Right? Or maybe, I don't know. But the bottom line is it's not going to cost you much to apply a little bit of phosphorus with some nitrogen at planting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you're going to have a very, very cheap insurance policy against cold, wet weather conditions where you see these big yield increases from starter. And so to continue to kind of show some practical examples of what we could see here, I've got a study up here that I've been running for several years, and this is the average of 7 locations. And so the question I was asking in this study is, which nutrients are most important in an outer furrow starter fertilizer application? So I was really kind of targeting, when I developed this study, continuous corn environments where 2x2 nitrogen could be most beneficial to the crop. Okay. So the kind of the base or the check treatment is 180 pounds of N broadcasted. Then we looked at adding 60 pounds of starter as a 2x2 surface dribble band, 3x3x0, I think technically they call it. So in layman's terms, it was that 60 pounds of nitrogen was split on both sides of the row, dribble on the soil surface 3 inches from the crop. Okay, that's what was done in this study.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we applied 60 pounds of nitrogen like that with the planter. Then the next treatment was 60 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of phosphorus. The next treatment was that same 60 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of phosphorus, 10 pounds of potassium, 10 pounds of phosphorus, 10 pounds of potassium, 10 pounds of sulfur. Then all that nitrogen, all those same nutrients as PK sulfur, and then a half a pound of zinc. Okay. So what we've seen is that, just by adding that 10 pounds of phosphorus, and again, a 250 bushel corn crop removes about 100 pounds. This is just 10 pounds, mind you. We saw about a roughly 5 bushel yield increase for applying that 10 pounds of phosphorus with that 60 pounds of nitrogen with the planter.
Mm-hmm.
And while this was with the planter, conceptually speaking, we could do that with RTK placement of fertilizer.
Yeah, if you're 3 inches over, we could easily, set that up with an ExactStrip line. Absolutely.
Right. And, we know from our commercial use cases that we can be pretty close.
Yeah.
Are we always going to be right where you want it? No.
No.
But we're going to be within a couple inches,
Yeah.
typically, on
Yeah.
flat to gently rolling topography. Okay. So I think the agronomic rationale is there for utilizing this technology to apply starter. And why aren't more guys? I mean, I'm sitting here talking about how starter is so great and we're getting these yield increases from outer furrow starter and in-furrow starter. Why aren't we doing it?
It's inconvenient. I hate it. I hate dragging tanks to the field. I hate moving pickups with tanks attached to them. I hate getting semis brought to my farm all the time.
Are you busy that time of year?
I got a couple things going on, yeah.
Right. So it'd be much faster to do this with a post machine.
Yes.
Or potentially a floater, but either, it could be done with either.
Mm-hmm.
You could do it much faster to get out there earlier before we're worried about planting corn, get this done. Wouldn't have to worry about tendering to the planter. At the same time, I think everybody's telling farmers they need to plant their corn and soybean as early as possible for maximum yield, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
So planting rapidly as possible, getting planted in the right window is all important, and starter does slow the process down. Now, for some people that have the labor and infrastructure, great, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
There are advantages. But for others, it's difficult,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this is a way to help relieve some of those logistical constraints.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most people already have the equipment to do it. You don't have to buy more equipment necessarily. You don't have to add starter to your planter. It could be done in a lot of cases with your existing equipment. Okay? And so we didn't even talk about the sulfur and the zinc, huge yield increases from the sulfur and zinc in this study. But of course, we could add things like sulfur and zinc to that NP application using placement technology in the spring, like we're talking about here.
I wanted to point out this zinc number. I mean, the first initial look at this graph, I don't want to say I was shocked by the increase of yield and just by applying 10 pounds of sulfur, but almost 6 bushels there with a half pound of zinc.
Yeah, and so that's part of the reason why I've been pretty drummed up about zinc's important because data sets like this and other data sets I have, particularly when you apply that zinc with a sulfur, with ATS, we see that surprisingly large yield increase.
Do you think we should be looking at a rate of closer to a pound of zinc?
I think it's possible, and I'm probably going to start doing some studies in 25 to start answering that question. But I do agree that if we're seeing a 6 bushel yield increase out of a half a pound of zinc, are we applying enough zinc? And I think it's a good question, and that might be the case. But since this isn't a rate study, I can't answer that question definitively, of course. But I think it is possible.
Okay.
And for the cost of the zinc, the ammoniated zinc, it's relatively inexpensive. I think it's definitely not wise to apply less than half a pound. Let's put it that way. Okay? Because we do see a very good ROI from that. So, what else could we put in that brew?
Oh my gosh. What about a biological, or maybe I've got some iron issues in soybeans. Maybe I've got some phosphorus uptake issues. I've got low testing phosphorus. I've got high pH environments. Is there any products out there like that, Jake, that we could be looking at?
Yeah, there are, Chris. I think you've seen this presentation.
Have I?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, yes, and yes. So, biologicals. Obviously, I've been doing a lot of investigation of biological type products and different application methods. And just as an example, we have up here on the screen my in-furrow data, long-term in-furrow data with micro-AZ. And I've talked a lot about micro-AZ in the past. We can put some links to this video where I talk about micro-AZ in more detail and what it is. But just simply put, this product's increased corn yields 5 bushels per acre on average. And roughly about 75% of the time we see yield increases, and it's statistically significant, and the product isn't very expensive. So it makes sense that a product like this could add ROI to a farmer's operation. Mm-hmm. But this was applied in-furrow, okay? And again, not everybody has in-furrow because of the problems we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think it's possible that a product like this could be added to that application, and those will be things I will be investigating.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about Avail T5 in the past.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only applying 10 pounds of phosphorus, is it worth it putting the Avail in here? Probably not, but it's an example of a product that could be used in an application like this. You talked a little bit about IDC and soybean, so it doesn't apply to everybody. But up north, there's a lot, at our northern locations, there's a lot of acres of iron deficiency chlorosis.
Yeah.
And an in-furrow application of an iron chelate is a legitimate answer to help alleviate some of those issues up there. But again, you get up there, it's even bigger fields, bigger farmers, and there's less labor, generally speaking. So again, it's a time issue. Mm-hmm. It's a time, manpower issue, and if you could inject an iron chelate into the boom of a floater, you could potentially apply an iron chelate with your soybean fertilizer where you're going to plant the crop. Mm-hmm. And so those are trials we have ongoing right now up in north central Iowa.
Yep.
So I think there are many use cases for this technology, and kind of this fall P&K fertilizer application placement was only the beginning. I also might add that while I'm not seriously confident that the exact placement of a band on the row or 2 inches from the row with nitrogen is absolutely necessary, what I am convinced though is necessary is applying the phosphorus and the zinc close to the crop. Okay. So even if my data basically says, you can apply the nitrogen 4 or 5 inches from the crop, and that might be the case, and see the same yield increase as 0 inches, but they're both better than broadcast, you're still going to have to apply that nitrogen close to the crop to get the benefit out of the phosphorus and the zinc, and probably other products like this micro-AZ. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can debate whether or not the nitrogen placement's important because the nitrogen is mobile, but I think we're going to find that adding products like a little bit of phosphorus or micro-AZ is very important, and we know those products are going to have to be placed close to the row for a fact.
The other question I think I'll ask you as well is, going back to this whole biological thing, we want these products because they're living to stay living. And a lot of them will work with, you know, your potassium hydroxide fertilizers, the low salt index fertilizers. But we could be talking about suspension here.
Right.
And that's pretty high in salt content.
Right.
You know, how much caution should we be placing on this as far as adding these products in that are living bacteria?
A considerable amount. And so that's part of the reason why I do a lot of testing, because in my studies, we actually put those products in the fertilizer and apply it.
Okay.
The other thing that I do often, not always, but often, is I partner with the manufacturer. I send them samples of our products, and I usually have a sample that is about as salty as you can imagine, and then they can do some assays to understand, okay, what is the survivability of XYZ biological product in our fertilizer blend. So they can do some assays where they look at survivability over time. So it's a very important question, which is why we do studies in the real world with real fertilizer and mixing these products together. It's a very important question. Well, Chris, we could keep talking, but this is probably getting pretty long in the tooth. So I hope you're excited about the potential of this ExactStrip technology. And by the way, you know, I'm sitting here basically showing a lot of caution about nitrogen placement and potential for injury, and that's all true. But today, what I'm reasonably confident about is that, you know, you could apply 100 pounds of nitrogen as UAN and 20 pounds of phosphorus and 10 pounds of sulfur, let's say, and half a pound of zinc. If you're applying that 3 inches from the row, you're not going to see any injury. And there may be a reasonable yield increase. You know, if you go back here and look at this data, this was applied 3 inches from the row at planting with the planter. But exact stripping something like this, 3 inches from the row, my speculation is you would see exactly what I'm seeing here. So I think some of this could be used now. But before we start applying 100 pounds of nitrogen and 10 pounds of sulfur on the row where we're going to plant, I think we need to just hold off on that a little bit.
We want to be moved over just a little bit. Just
for now.
Just for the caution, at least for now.
Correct. Yes. So with that, we've talked a whole bunch, Chris. I want to thank the growers for listening. I hope you're as excited as I am about the use cases for this placement technology going forward. And stay tuned because there's a lot more coming.
Thank you.
Lead Academy.
Liqui-Grow
Excellent.
And agronomy
development.